Sorry, that took longer than I thought. So supporting the bereaved is what we're talking about today. We've been on a bit of a journey, haven't we? In the 3 seminars, we've talked about funerals, particularly taking funerals in lockdown. We've talked about losses, multiple losses last week. We didn't talk much about grief last week, and we're going to talk a little bit about grief, the experience of being bereaved this week, and how we might support bereaved people, what bereavement might look like, both now, support for people now and in the future. So there's a two-pronged thing going on, well, three-pronged. There's the talk about grief, the talk about how we can offer support now, and the talk about how we can offer support in the time to come. I've got a sense that once lockdown lifts, all those people that are able to grieve properly at the moment will experience their grief then, and there'll be a real time of grieving. So I'm hoping that this might encourage you, enable you to maybe work with others to think about how you might encourage people, help people through the stages of bereavement. You'll probably know this story that I've started with. A woman went to the Buddha carrying in her arms her dead son. She asked for his healing. The Buddha asked her to find a few grains of mustard seed, but they must only come from a house where no one was touched by death. After a year's search, the woman returned, having found there was no such house. You probably have read some version of that story somewhere. I think it's really important to remember that everybody is affected by death. We talked last week of everybody's affected by loss, so we have cumulative losses, and everybody's loss. So although everybody's affected by death, everybody's affected by loss, everybody's loss is unique. So everybody's bereavement is unique to them. It's really easy to say, I know how you feel because this happened to me. And actually, we don't know, do we? And we don't know what the grieving process will be like. It can't be, despite what you're going to hear me say in a few minutes, it can't be boxed up and made into something safe, despite the fact that it's part of life, really. I think the thing we bring most to issues about grief and bereavement are that we're a resurrection people. And this is our faith. So I've used these 3 verses, but I could have picked lots of verses, couldn't I? About hope and God supporting us, God saving us. Not everybody we encounter has got this level of faith. So sometimes we have to hold within us the faith on their behalf. Sometimes we have to hold within us the hope on their behalf. Sometimes we have to hold within us the peace on someone else's behalf. And that's part of our task in our supporting of the bereaved as Christians, is that we bring in ourselves and with ourselves our resurrection faith, our hope, and our knowledge that we're all children of God. God knows and loves each one of us. He longs to enter into relationship with us, regardless of who we are. And our job isn't to judge or to condemn. Our job is to be with. I call this slide, there's a wideness in God's mercy. We have to remember that. If you remember that lovely hymn, there's a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea. And that's the God who we love, and that's the God who we want to share with other people. So I really just wanted to say that. I've not been doing lots of theology as I've gone on, but I think it's really important that we know about that hope. Don't always have to express it or preach. We have to be it, really, quite often, and just hold it and know it ourselves. So I'm going to start with this slide, which is taken from Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. Kubler-Ross worked in the 60s, 70s with the dying. And it was very unusual for anyone at that time to be listening to the dying and how they experienced their dying, the process of dying. She points out these areas, the shock, so the awareness of the fatal illness. If you see at the beginning of the timeline, there's shock and denial and anger and bargaining. See how the anger and bargaining are really overlapping. Depression, acceptance, which is a bit broken up. And she puts in this dikathexis, which is an acceptance of things as they are. So it's beyond acceptance and kind of separation and are ready for death. So we can't use that. The dikathexis is really in the dying process, but the other stages she's adapted for grief and grieving. And somebody talked last week about the change curve, which I'm going to talk about later on, and Kubler-Ross has informed that as well. You see throughout all this, there's some hope. And sometimes that hope is borne by other people as it's shared with the dying person. So that sense of hope is there throughout the timeline. And I really like this thing of Kubler-Ross because it reminds us of where all this study came from, really, because this was really the starting point. So the first stage is denial and isolation. She says the numbness in this stage protects us from the big shock or from the big experience of bereavement. It's too much for us to take in. So the denial is kind of that's too much to take in. I can't believe he's died. You hear people saying that again and again. Can't believe he's not here. I go downstairs expecting to see him and he's not there. Sometimes people say that they see loved ones who've died in the street. And that's part of the denial. And one of the ways of getting over it is to tell the story of loss over and over again. So someone else needs to be available to hear the story of that loss over and over again until it can become real. I think seeing the body is one of those moments where the knowing the person's died becomes real. Now that's not always possible now. It's not always possible in this time to see people dying, to be with them, or even to see the body. So we've got to really think about that. How do we enable people to go through this stage of denial with us and come through it? And I think it's about listening to the story that's over and over again. The second stage is anger, not necessarily logical anger or valid anger, just anger. It might be anger at the loved one for not taking better care, for not going to the doctors, for not looking after themselves, for going and shaking hands with someone that they shouldn't have shaken hands with. Anger at self for not noticing or stopping the death somehow, even when that's completely illogical and not possible. That anger can be misdirected, can be directed at all sorts of people, and it can be directed at God. And of course, anger can be turned in on the self, and that looks like guilt. Excuse me, that's guilt when anger starts turning in on itself. I want to tell you what Kubler-Ross said. She said, anger is strength, and it can be an anchor, giving temporary structure to the nothingness of loss. Isn't that lovely? Shall I read it again? Anger is strength, and it can be an anchor, giving temporary structure to the nothingness of loss. And the third stage is bargaining. Bargaining is much easier to recognize in the dying because that works kind of, oh, if I stop eating meat, can I live for a bit longer? You know, if I do all my medication or if I start running 30 miles a day, will that enable me to live a bit longer? So we see that quite a lot when people are ill or have a diagnosis of terminal illness. The bargaining at this in grief is an if only I'd been there. If only you can hear it's very similar to the anger, can't you? If only I'd stopped him going out. If only we'd kept the doors closed. we want life to be returned to what it was and our loved one restored. And so we do this, if only. What if I'd done that or said that? Or what if I'd phoned the doctor? The bargain might be that we see our loved ones in heaven. God, if I live a blameless life now, will I see my loved one in heaven? And maybe a bargain making with God that we won't suffer any further tragedies. So there is a bit of bargaining there, isn't there? That if only. And we see that quite often in the bereaved. If only I'd done that, if only I'd noticed, if only I'd phoned the doctor sooner. The fourth one is depression. Kubler-Ross describes this as a fog of intense sadness. Isn't that lovely? A fog of intense sadness. A sense of what's the point, a lethargy. We don't need to snap out of it. Nobody needs to snap out of it or to be cheered up. We have a thing that we can't be unhappy and count your blessings. But actually, this is a sad situation. When somebody dies and you're bereaved, it's a sad situation. And it probably doesn't require any immediate fixing. There are some specific sorrows. And you know, just being told to look on the bright side of life isn't going to do it. You might end up looking on the bright side of life, but we need to be allowed to sit in that depression for a while and someone to sit in it with you. And that's very difficult. I think sitting with someone who's depressed is really difficult because it's too easy to absorb their sadness into yourself and then you don't want to do it anymore, and then you begin not to want to go back. So, you know, in terms of pastoral care, it's a big one, this, just to be able to sit with somebody who's sad. And it's what sad people need, really. And acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean it's okay. Acceptance isn't, oh, this is great, I'm pleased this happens, all's well, the world. Acceptance is a kind of accepting the reality of what is over time and finding some peace and hope in a situation that at some stage in here felt hopeless. Just before I move on from Kubler-Ross, she talks about anticipatory grief, which is the anticipation of grief. And I think I mentioned it last week. I think that's happening to us quite a lot at the moment, that people are anticipating grief, anticipating things that might go wrong, and being really anxious. In that anticipation, being really anxious because their safe world that they know about is being turned upside down, and there's an unsafe world. And that's one of the roots, Kubler-Ross says, of anticipatory grief.
Over to me.
Sheila, yes.
Okay, I'm going to skip through these fairly quickly because I'm aware of the passage of time and we've got a lot to get through. So I'm currently one of the group helpers with Holy Trinity Brompton, who are delivering this bereavement course called the Bereavement Journey. Yvonne Richmond-Tulloch is behind it, and she also set up and runs At a Loss, and I think you've got the reference to that at the end of this presentation. HTB have been delivering this course for about 23 years, but obviously in small groups with people face to face. The current course was written or adapted and written in 2015, and now I'm on the first course that they're delivering via Zoom, so just exactly like this. So it's a little bit of a trial to see whether it is actually going to work, to see whether people will engage with it. We currently have about 80 people on the course. There's a huge, massive demand for it. And they didn't advertise this at all. It was just word of mouth, where people sort of found out that this was going to be on. We run in groups of 8 with a facilitator and a helper with each group, and all the groups all run at exactly the same time. Therefore, 2 hours on a Monday evening, and it's 6 sessions in each course. So we're getting a lot of feedback about things that need to be changed about the course because it's being delivered virtually. But I have to say that people are engaging with it really well. They're coming back every week. They're participating, you know, when we're discussing things. And to be honest, it's almost, once you get into it, it's almost like just being in a room with them. Obviously, it's not, but it's actually working much better than I thought it might. There's a bit of tweaking to be done, but that's currently being done. And I'm hoping, or I'm going to deliver this course in Cumbria through my job with Churches Together. So just keep an eye open for that. I'm leading on the second course, which is starting immediately after this one finishes. So it's probably going to be, I would have thought about August time. August, September, before we're actually delivering it in Cumbria. But if you want any more information, then do get back to me about that. Okay, can we have the next slide, Alison, please?
Yep. Oh, maybe. No, I seem to have gone to sleep. Oh, sorry.
There we go. So I don't think there's much more to say about this because Alison's already talked through these 5 stages of grief, which are fairly well recognised. But I think it's just to add that this is by no means a linear process, even though, you know, it seems to be set out like that. It's a bit of a dance back and forward, sideways, upside down, you name it, that people move between and around all these different stages, or maybe in more than one stage at the one time. It's just a constant ongoing process. Okay, next slide, please. But one of the things that we do on the bereavement journey is understand loss. And I know that we looked at that last week, but just to revisit that just for a moment, that what they say is that before we can actually start on that grieving process, we have to understand the loss. What is it that we've lost and how do we manage loss? And they go right back into different things that we might have lost as children. I mean, even just a cuddly toy, or maybe you lost friends when you moved school or something like that. But we all have lots and lots of losses in our life. And we will have been programmed, like we are with so many things as children, how we actually manage that loss. You know, were we told just to, you know, it wasn't important, just get on with it? Or did our parents or other friends or other family members actually talk about it and help us to understand why we felt how we feel? Were we allowed to be angry when we lost something? All those different things actually influence how we as adults, much, much later on in life, manage any losses that we experience, which includes, you know, the loss of a loved one. And if I just add at this point that the bereavement journey is specifically for people who have lost a loved one, and it's also not for people who are supporting people who are bereaved. It's specifically for the individual bereaved people. Anything else to say here? We have to accept the reality of the loss, and sometimes our minds play tricks on us and we imagine that we've lost something that we hadn't, or we think, especially where there's been complicated relationships, we might imagine that somebody was nicer to us than they actually were. So it's trying to get clear in our heads what it is that we have actually lost. Or it might be that we've actually gained something. I knew a woman a number of years ago who was in really quite a difficult marriage, but she stuck with it with her husband, and was really quite sort of, you know, she wasn't able to be herself. She was quite sort of suffocated by the relationship. And then he died very suddenly in a car accident. And she absolutely blossomed after he died. I think initially she did feel guilty about that, but she did grieve, but very quickly. And then she felt that she had regained her life. So that's one of the complications that we might have to manage. Next slide. is it me for the next one? I think it is.
Yes.
Okay, some reactions to grief. These are many and varied. I'm sure you'll recognise a lot of these. I think other things that I can add in here is that we might also feel a real sense of regret, which is, you know, a bit of disappointment with ourselves that we didn't do something, or we feel that we didn't do well enough, or we didn't say before our loved one died. Guilt, anger and guilt are huge, and as I said earlier, either of them or both of them can come in at any of the stages of the grieving journey. And all but one of the people in the group that I'm helping with, the group of 8, all but one of them experienced the loss of a loved one a long time ago. But I mean, some of them, it's over 30 years ago, but they realised, I don't quite know how, because what I haven't found out from them is how they actually came to be on this journey in this group. But if grief isn't managed, then it will remain inside of us and eat away at us. And it may be that we have to just start this process much further on in our lives. Also just pick out that thing about a crisis in faith. Again, on the bereavement journey, they often say, and this is not to be critical, but they often say that people of faith can find grieving more difficult. Sometimes it can complicate matters. Some people, it strengthens their faith and they find it very comforting. Other people will start to really question it and wonder why this has happened to them. Okay, next slide, please. So how we react to our grieving, and I put stories in there because, like so many different things I'm sure you've experienced, when you come together with other people who have experienced the same thing as you, people start telling their stories. And on this bereavement journey, when people start telling stories about how they felt, or saying that, you know, they thought it was a bit strange that they felt one particular way or something like that, it's a revelation to other people, and people can, you can see their, you know, their faces lifting, their mood lifting, as they start to realize that it's not just them that feels like this, that actually it's normal, and all variations of normal as well. So you can see these couple of quotes on this slide here. Other people's responses may be helpful or unhelpful. We've heard many stories already on this course, not this one, I mean the Bereavement Journey course, of, you know, very unhelpful things that people have said, usually along the lines of snap out of it, or you've had long enough now, or isn't it time that you got over this, or something like that. Also quite a few stories about people not being allowed to grieve, it just being blocked out, especially if the bereavement that they experienced was a long time ago, say when they were a child, it might have been a grandparent or something like that. Quite often the reaction was, well, they're gone now, you just need to get on with it and we don't need to talk about them anymore. All sorts of different complications to that. I've experienced a couple of really complicated bereavements in my own life. My dad died of Alzheimer's 3 years ago, and my mother, who had sort of early stage dementia at the time, just would not acknowledge, she knew he had died, but she just thought, well, that was it, and told me as soon as he had died, he said, I just had to go home now. And she continued like that, and I had to stay with her for about another 3 weeks, and every single day she asked me why I was still there and what was there to do. I should just be going home. So my grieving process couldn't begin until much later. but it's important to know that if we are denied that opportunity to grieve, it's never too late. It's something about this grieving process that no matter when you start doing it, you can go through this, relatively recognized process in your own way, in your own time, and you will be able to manage it. And I like this is from the Bereavement Journey, the bit at the bottom of that slide. Our family was a 4-legged stool and now needs to become a 3-legged stool. And if you imagine a 4-legged stool, if you chopped one leg off, the stool will remain wobbly. That's a really good way of illustrating that if you have a proper 3-legged stool, it will be very stable because everybody has shifted slightly. And sometimes that's what needs to happen within families or within friendship groups or wider extended families, that people need to, perhaps do different jobs or just adjust themselves to then become a solid, stable family unit again. And I also like that quote from C.S. Lewis, "I'm aware that I'm an embarrassment to all my friends." This is after his wife Joy died. And he was behaving in, all sorts of different ways, continuing to function, continuing to teach at the university. But he felt that he was an embarrassment to all his friends because he wasn't as he was before. And of course, nobody talked about what he was going through. Next one, please. Back to you.
Me. So this is the emotional cycle of change, which you'll have come across, which is based on Kubler-Ross's work. I just wanted to show to you, you can see how uncomplicated it is. And Sheila and I have just spent 20 minutes or so making it complicated, because it is. It's not a down and up. And it could be that people move around up and down this. There's doubt, denial, anger, desperation, anxiety, hope, confidence. It's called the emotional cycle of change because it can happen in any change. And I think Paul, I don't know if he's here this week, but Paul was talking about it last week, that he used it as a management tool to enable change to happen as well. So I kind of wanted to show that to you and show how far away it is from Kubler-Ross's first research, really. And it seems to be a simple thing. And she never intended it to be this simple. However, some people do like models. And if you want to show somebody something simple that says this is normal, this up and down thing is quite normal. After my father died, somebody showed me this for the first time, and I transformed how my grief, really, because I was able to see that I was in a normal place. So really, this is what grief looks like. It doesn't look like that nice, smooth line. It looks like a knotted mess. It's not in a curve. It might not quite be as knotty as that, but for some people it is. Just looks like somebody's knitting has been unravelled, doesn't it? And maybe that's how it feels. I rather like that. When I was doing my research for this, I thought I'd share it with you. But really, it's probably more like a spiral staircase. So McNeish wrote a paper in 2013. I've got a PDF of it. If anybody's interested enough to want to read it, get in touch with me. It's like a spiral staircase, which I think is much more realistic. So he critiques this straight line very much and said it's like a spiral staircase. We might come back to almost the same place, but not exactly the same place. Of course, there's a danger with a spiral that it can go down and down and around to a point, which this picture actually makes it look like it is, rather than going up and opening. So we've got to be very careful on the spiral that we're not going down to a point at the bottom, but we're going up and the spiral is opening up. I like the way he talks about it, that there's a transition between the room of loss, where the bonds are severed, and the rooms of restoration, where bonds continue. So it's as if you're enabling somebody who's been bereaved to live in the whole of the house. to open the door of the room of loss as well as the room of restoration. I think that's, I rather like that. Fits in with the spiral staircase going up, and you try all the rooms, brave enough to open the door onto that room of loss that so many people keep shut. So I like the spiral staircase rather than the line, or even the knotted knitting as a model of maybe how grief works. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about how we begin to talk about how we support the bereaved. As I said earlier, we've got a theology of hope. Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. That's where we begin. We begin by being alongside people, not knowing all the answers. A theology of hope shares the grief of others, listens to the cries at the absence of the deceased and of God, and waits in silence. We want to fix it. I heard someone say to me the other day they wanted to fix it, and I don't think we can fix it. I think we can be with it and support people by being with them. Of course, many of you are busy and can't do it all by yourself. I want to suggest that you begin now, even by Zoom, even though you're not physically in touch with people, to think about how your ministry to the bereaved will continue for the rest of this year. What will happen in the autumn when people start asking for memorial services and who's going to care for them. So I want to suggest you really think about establishing a bereavement team. This great Grove booklet's available online. I think it's $3.99. Helen Thorpe tells you how to do it. Because really ministry to the bereaved is a ministry for the whole congregation, not just for an individual. How do you work as a team? How do you select pastoral ministers? What qualities should we be looking for in choosing someone to be in the bereavement team? You might want to write the answer to that in the chat, and then we can share that later on. What qualities should we look for in choosing someone to be in the bereavement team? And working as a team, we're selecting people well, we're training and supporting. And if you decide to do that, Helen Thorpe's book's great about training people. I don't think it needs to be complicated. I think you could set up something quite simple in the first instance to aid this, and maybe even use this if we get the recording out. So be present, be alongside, keep promises to visit. That's really important, the keeping promises to visit. Ring before visiting, don't just turn up. You know, I don't know if this happens to you. Some days when I'm depressed or miserable, I don't even get dressed. And I couldn't bear it if the vicar or some church person arrived on my doorstep unexpectedly. So, you know, ring before you go. Listen attentively, even when the story is repeated. That's quite difficult. There's a narrative bond. The links are made through stories all the time. So listen to the stories, the link to the present, the link to the past, link to the future, link to God. These stories work in a mixed up way. You're not fixing, you're noticing feelings, notice your own feelings when you're visiting as well. We all have grief. I'm going to share a book with you that talks about that. You know, we all carry our griefs and our losses. So notice the feelings that you have that are yours and ones that you're picking up from the person. Think about safety and predictability, not just for you, but for them. People that have experienced loss and feel really unsteady need a safety in their relationship and need something that's going to be predictable. And as I say, it doesn't have to be you. The Church of England have produced this lovely thing with the lovely Kate Botley. And I'm not going to show it to you now. I've put it on the PowerPoint so that you can watch it later or you can Google it. I hope I'm not going to show it to you now. I hope I'm going to move on. Oh, no, it's going to play. Sorry, I can't stop Kate Botley talking. I think she might experience that in her life quite often. And I can't escape from my PowerPoint now. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Wardens, I wanted to also tell you about Warden's grieving process. I think these 4 categories that Wardens suggest really reflect Kubler-Ross. So I'm not going to go through them. I think they can be mapped onto Kubler-Ross really well. I think the description maps to Kubler-Ross. I think the challenges are really helpful for us to look at in terms of supporting the bereaved. How do you help people to accept? How do you encourage people to express their pain rather than suppress it? And how do you encourage those new skills? Think about the things. These are real practical things. There are things people can't do certainly when a partner dies. You know, that a woman. Well, I'm really sticking to gender roles here, but it does work that one person might not know how to do the gardening, one person might not know how to cook, one person might not know how to do the finances. So there's lots of areas where someone might feel really undermined because they can't do the practical things of living without that other person. And I think they're practical things that we can assist with. And helping them not to give up the person that they've loved, but to find an appropriate place for them in their emotional lives, which is about story and photographs and still remembering, keeping that door of the loss open and finding a place to talk about it. And the last one I'm going to talk to is this meaning making. Once you begin to make meaning, you're beginning to ask spiritual questions. So the process of making meaning, making sense of something, is effectively a spiritual process. And it might be through the Psalms of Lament, but it is a spiritual task. And our job is to be with people as well in that spiritual task. I don't think it's about conversion. I think it's allowing that sense of meaning. Why this? Why now? Begin to ask those questions and sit with the questions and maybe begin to answer them. Okay, back to Sheila. Sheila, I might start the PowerPoint again.
Okay, so we've already mentioned the power of story, and as I said earlier, you know, that's what we're finding on the bereavement journey, that even though people are distanced by Zoom, they are still sharing their stories really well. And, you know, like I said earlier, you can see the recognition on other people's faces when they realize that they've experienced a similar thing. I think that all of these things, you know, are complicated at present when we are socially distanced. We're not seeing the people that would otherwise give us support, and I think that really needs to be recognised. On the current bereavement journey course, that's fine. You can stick with that one. On the current bereavement journey course, there is a group specifically for people who have lost somebody to COVID. So obviously very recently, and got the shock and everything else and not being able to see them and so on. And I've heard some fact that we sort of group leaders have a debrief session at the end of each delivery session. And I've heard that some of the materials will need to be adapted specifically for people who have been bereaved very recently due to COVID, but I don't know the detail of that, and we don't have anybody in our group who have experienced that. Can you just go back?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, thanks. We're encouraged to help people on the course to understand that they can grow through grief. There is a model, a really, really nice model, but I'm not actually allowed to share any of those things with you yet until we're actually delivering the course. But it is very simple and it's really very good. And it basically says that, you know, our grief initially feels it's as big as we are, overwhelming, too much to bear. It's like it's taken over our whole life. And as time moves on, we imagine that we have a task to reduce our grief to a manageable size, but people then start to question, do they want to do that? What does it mean about the person who they've lost? Or guilt can come in again, because what if they can't do that? What if they can't reduce it? So what the bereavement journey says, that, you know, working through this process in any form, not just going on the bereavement journey, it might be doing it yourself or speaking to people or reading something. It's that our life actually enlarges and we grow to incorporate that grief, that loss, to keep it safe within us. Yet it frees us up to function and move on. And the diagram shows how, you know, physically, you know, we become, you know, our life is represented in this diagram just by a circle, and we show that the grief actually stays more or less the same size, but our life enlarges around it and manages it. I remember years ago when I was bereaved after my brother died in a car crash, and somebody said to me eventually, you know, you have to take this knot of grief out from inside you, look at it, toss it around, try to understand it, but then you have to put it back in, because otherwise it leaves a hole. And I've never ever forgotten that, and I think it's a really, really useful way of explaining it and learning that, you know, I can't forget that my brother died. I can't forget the trauma that we went through. It happened to be Christmas Eve as well. It was, you know, very, very tragic. But by working with it, you know, I could put this grief back in there and manage it and just keep it safe within me. Next slide, please. That's just practically how we can help. All these things are quite obvious, ordinary. Again, some people tell us that they do get lots of offers of help. Other people tell us that they didn't get any at all. My experience with various bereavements I've had has been mixed. But I think one issue that's common to a lot of them is that lots of people are offering practical help early on, and then it gradually dwindles. And sometimes people are actually more buoyant in the early days, and then it's when they, you know, later on, when everybody's sort of gone back to work, gone home, etc., etc., the grief really starts to hit them then, but people are not offering those things. So I think, you know, one of the main messages that I would want to give you is that, you know, there is no normal way of doing this, and somebody might be grieving really, really badly and in need of help years and years and years later, that they may well have suppressed the grief, and then something will trigger it and it comes to the fore, and they will need these practical ways of people helping them just as much as if they had been just very, very recently bereaved.
Can I just say something about these practical dimensions? Because I think a lot of these things can be done even now, even with this social distancing. Somebody said in chat that we can't visit people, but actually things are beginning to loosen up. We're allowed to see people 2 meters distance. We're allowed to go out for a walk with people. We could take food, we can do shopping, we can do gardening. So, you know, we can be a bit creative about ways around at the moment, but it won't be long, I don't think, until things open up a little bit more. Yeah.
And I've got a friend in the village where I live who died of COVID back in April, and I go and see his wife every morning. I have done ever since the day he died, and we just sit in her front garden for about half an hour, and she says, you know, how much she really values that, and it gives us something to get out of bed for in the morning. She looks forward to it. You know, we're not really doing very much, but what we're doing is we're really studying her front lawn and all the different things that are growing in it. So we can do things, and you know, that was at the height of the pandemic that he died. But you are able to be, you know, socially distanced from people, and people do still feel supported, even though you might not be doing much more than just being there 2 meters apart.
Yeah, thank you.
Next one, I can't remember if it's me or if it's you.
Let me talk through this one quickly. There's lots of ways of remembering. We're going to look at ways of remembering in the autumn. This is just to flag this up. We talked about it in the first session. There's Light of a Life hospices often have them. This is a photograph from the end of an All Souls Day service where people had come up and lit a candle as names were being read out. And everybody can be invited to that. So even people that don't want to have a memorial service in the autumn can be invited to the All Souls Day service. And it doesn't just have to be funerals that you've done or that have happened in your church. It can be anybody in your community can be invited and names read out. The burial of ashes. Remember that somebody that's been to the creme, there's still the ashes to dispose of. And it could be that the burial of ashes becomes the funeral, you know, where more people are invited. There'll be times of anniversary. So, you know, in a year's time, anniversaries will be coming up. Are you going to remember the anniversaries of the people whose funerals you've been doing or people you've been visiting, or are you going to wait for them to come to you? Maybe it's a thing to think about next year, is how to mark that anniversary time, which might be really painful because they'll be thinking back to the loss of the loved one, which they might have started to get used to now, but they'll be knowing that they lost the grieving. They'll be knowing they lost the grand funeral that maybe they wanted. So, you know, there'll be just a bit of an edge of loss as they've reflected on the whole experience. Light a candle. There's a thing on the Church of England website which is for Light a Candle. I just couldn't put the link, but if you do Church of England funerals Light a Candle, you'll find the link. I think I've shared it. I think I shared it in the first session. Sheila, I think you were going to speak to this.
Oh yeah, this is a great quote by Henri Nouwen, who I really like, which I think just sums it up really, that we just need to be alongside people, not necessarily doing anything more than just being there, because everybody is different how they're going to manage or not manage their grieving and their bereavement. So it is about just being there. It is very much about tolerating, not knowing, not curing, not healing, not being able to fix it, not being able to make anybody feel better, but simply just being there. And Alison, did you want to talk to the image?
Just want to talk a little bit about the picture. It's 5 to 7, so I've realised I've talked too much this week. This is La Pietà by an artist called Roger Alderson from the Northeast. I really love this picture. He gave me permission. I found him after I found the picture and he gave me permission to use it. I just love that Mary and Jesus are the boundaries of them are fuzzy, which is what happens in grief, isn't it? The boundary between yourself and somebody else has gone fuzzy and you can't quite distinguish between one and the other. Can't quite distinguish the Mary and holding her son, the bereaved woman holding her son, and the son is dead. And I just think it's very beautiful, and I think it says something really poignant about the grief, even when somebody can't physically hold their loved one who's died, that'll be how they're feeling, and that the edges of themselves are no longer there. Yeah.
And I just put this together. I'm aware that we're running short of time, so I'll leave you to read these. But I think sort of slightly in summary, that I mean, somebody said that, you know, suffering is inevitable, misery is a choice. And I think, you know, maybe at an appropriate time, and I don't know when that would be, it might be years after somebody has lost someone, I think we can be there alongside them, as Henri Nguyen has just said, but perhaps helping them to understand that they do have a choice about this. You know, they can choose to be stuck if that's what they want to be. Obviously, you wouldn't use these terms. You might not even use the word choice. But, you know, it does take some courage to work through grief. And I think some people don't realise that they have that choice to actually be brave and to tackle it. They think this is something that's been done to them and they just have to put up with it, being miserable for the rest of their life. So I think, you know, pointing out to people that they do actually have a choice. And I like that quote from the Queen Mother, you know, when does it get better, ma'am? It doesn't get better, we get better at it. Which, you know, as I said earlier, and I've said many times, can be at any time in our lives. And I guess the trick for us as supporters is trying to identify when the time has come where somebody might want to get better at it. So we just have to keep our antennae up about that.
Lovely, thank you, Sheila. I want to do the resources. It's 7 o'clock. I'm really sorry. So we're going to run over 5 minutes, but I've skipped the resources every week, and I think it's really important. The first one was recommended by one of our children and young people's workers, and she recommended this live webinar talking about loss and bereavement with children and young people. And this is her book. So Amanda, I can't even say her name, Sederhelm, leads the seminar, and this is the book. So if you're working with children and young people, that's great. I've used a picture here from these blob bereavement cards. I'm just holding them up, but you might not be able to see me as well as the screen, which I talked about last week as well. They're great for working with children and young people. I think you could use them to work with all sorts of people. And there's books for children. Richard recommended one in the first week that I've forgotten, but here's some Badger's Parting Gifts. There's been a whole load recently. This picture is from Nicholas Allen's book, Heaven, When the Angels Come to Take a Dog Away to Heaven. It's very sweet. Waterbugs and Dragonflies, you might know. It's very well known. I think it's lovely, Always and Forever. So there's a few books for children. Do you know, I don't think adults are above some of these books, because they express it very simply and they're very beautiful. And sometimes even adults can say, oh, that's lovely, you know. So you can get books like this into people's hands by saying, oh, I bought this by accident and I wondered if you wanted to have a look at it, or whatever sort of subterfuge you use. And there's other books. So these are more grown-up books. I used this book, Dying to Live, in a lot of my prep today. Anderson and Foley's Mighty Stories, Dangerous Rituals, very good. The Wild Edge of Sorrow is a book I was referring to earlier. Francis Weller has worked with the Bereavement Journey for a long, long time. And he suggests that everybody holds sorrow within them. And we carry our griefs for years and years. So quite a lot of depression and quite a lot of our not flourishing as human beings in this life is that we carry with us our grief. He's Californian, so it's quite Californian, if you know what I mean, as a book. But I think it's worth reading. It's been very well recommended to me, very frequently recommended to me. Caroline Brazier isn't a Christian, she's a Buddhist, and her book about listening to the other is very simple, really straightforward listening skills. Best book on listening I've read. All in the End is Harvest. It's got resources for funerals and things. You might know it, it's pretty old. I bought 6 copies of this on Amazon for about £1 each. and I give them to people. And so you might like to look at it and read something, especially if you're having a memorial service. It might be something, and then people will read them however much they want to. The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse, I've used this little quote from. It's not about death, it's just a lovely book with very beautiful illustrations. So if you haven't come across it, it might be worth seeking out. Jane Ingham wrote a book called The Bereavement Journey, and See You Soon, Philippa Skinner wrote after her son had died as an adult. So there were just some books that I found useful. Other people, I can see the chat pinging away, so you might be writing. If you write the books in the chat that you want to recommend, I'll not finish the session until I've caught them all from the chat, and I'll put them on the PowerPoint that I sent you afterwards. So if you want to put anything, any of resources that you know in there, that would be great. There's some good web resources. Care for the Family has got a bereavement page. Pray As You Go has got prayer tools for anxiety and loneliness and grief. You have to search through their website a little bit. I didn't want to share the link with you because it was so complicated, but you can do a search. ataloss.org is really helpful. Durham University have a Centre for Death and Life Studies. I've put the link there. They've got something specifically about grief in coronavirus. So they've been doing some specific work on that. So if you wanted to check that out, there's some real theological resources to figure these things out with. And my last slide, which I'm not going to share with you, you'll have to look at it maybe sometime, is a very beautiful animation, which you may have seen, about this man who's an artist losing his wife and learning to live not as a four-legged stool actually, but as a three-legged stool, as a family again. So I'll just leave that, and when you get the PowerPoint, which we'll send to you afterwards, you'll be able to find that and follow that link.
Okay, Alison, can I just add in one thing that I forgot to mention, just very quickly? That one thing that we've talked about on the bereavement journey is that if somebody has an unresolved grief from years and years and years ago, and then let's say they lose somebody much more recently, they will always, and they stress always, they will always have to go back to that first loss and work through that before they can work through the more recent bereavement. And that was illustrated by several people in our group. One woman lost her son at only 8 months old, but when she was 16, her mother died. And she said that she was really surprised that when she went for counselling after her son died, all she talked about was the death of her mother. And they stressed it. So I'm just saying that because it might be a way to have a conversation with somebody. If you think that they're stuck or you don't know what to say, you could talk about something from a long, long time ago. And you may feel that that's not relevant, but actually it is, and it might help them to try and just tap into some unresolved grief that they may have.
Yeah, thank you. Good, well, thank you very much. I'm just looking through the chat. Carl Harding said, has meaning making got too privatized in our culture? We used to be good at shared meaning making, now everyone has to make up milestone moments for themselves. Discuss. Well, we could be here for the rest of the evening, and you might not have had your tea yet. I do think people do create a kind of ritual to make meaning with. We see it with flowers at the side of the roads, whereas I think once upon a time people would put flowers in church or in graveyards. They go to sides of the road. So I do think people find ritual, find ways of making meaning. What I think we as a church probably need to be really on and aware of is how do we join in that, or how do we encourage that, or how do we participate in the meaning making for people? Yeah. Mm-hmm. How do we enable people to make sense of themselves, and what are we offering that might encourage that? Does anyone else have anything to say to Carl about that?
I think one thing that I can add quickly is that, again, part of our discussion on the bereavement journey has been around rituals and how in other cultures, you know, there's more recognition given to death, dying and bereavement, whether that's wearing black or a number of people, and I remember this as well when I was a child, we used to keep the curtains closed if it was, you know, in the house of somebody who had died, and everybody just, you know, stayed away from that house. There's all sorts of different rituals in, you know, of sort of more formal grieving times, but people had quite a lot of positive things to say about those, and thought that it might actually be helpful to have some sort of formality around grieving just to get them started.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we talked about that a bit in the funerals one, in the first one, that maybe we've moved from funerals being a time of real grief to being a time of celebration of life, and in this period maybe we're moving back into the grief because there's so few people and it's so stark, and maybe that's maybe that's beginning to happen. I did a funeral last week and people were at the side of the road, but they were in mourning. They were wearing black, even though they weren't going to the funeral. They were just standing at the side of the road, and I thought that was really powerful. Yeah. Carl.
Can I just say that part of what prompted me to make that comment was precisely that, having done funerals under lockdown conditions, and just having the sense that families with just 12 of their close family around them seem to be more free to, I don't know, feel less under pressure. You know, it's this whole thing, it's happened with weddings, hasn't it? You now have to do it your own way, and therefore you have to think of all these ways of being completely individual, and to some extent with funerals. But this has sort of freed that, hasn't it? So there isn't pressure to think about the wider family and all the people from the bowls club and all the people from where the person used to work and all of this. There was just a freedom to sort of begin that grieving, or take the next stage in that grieving process in a really sort of I don't know, what seemed like quite an authentic way. And is there some way we can kind of hang on to that, help people to hang on to that a bit when it all gets huge again? I don't know, that's what I was thinking.
And will we as a society want to hang on to it? I went to see the widow, stood in our garden yesterday afternoon, and she said, I find this lockdown to be a blessing, because it's allowing me to go slowly. And although lots of people had been on the phone, she just felt like if in normal circumstances she would have had too many people coming around to see her and wanted a bit of her, and she didn't.
Yeah.
You know, and I you know, isn't that nice then? A bit of seclusion. We don't think of it really.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah, and I think my friend whose husband died in our village just recently, she would say the same thing. But I do wonder if once we do return to something akin to what we had before, and people are going out and being much more sociable again, whether a whole new wave of grieving will hit them because they're suddenly going out without their partner. If that's who it is.
I think there'll be. I think we're in a bit of a delay. Anyway, thank you very much. We could chatter on. If anyone wants to do a bit of chattering, please, this is your moment. Otherwise, I'm going to go. Thank you very much. Thank you for travelling with us. A lot of you have been here for 3 weeks. I'm pleased you came back. That was very reassuring. And there's some feedback form. If you want to do it again about another subject, say that on the feedback and we'll see what we can do. Okay.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Keep waving to everyone one by one, but you don't know I'm waving to everyone one by one, do you? Good.
Right, well, thank you, Alison.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.